In the late 19th century, a mysterious killer emerged in British society. Within just 3 months, he committed 5 brutal murders in a row. All 5 victims had their throats slit, and in several cases, their abdominal organs were even removed. Due to the backwardness of criminal investigation technology and the lack of experience in dealing with serial killers, the British police never solved the case. Later, the mysterious killer was called Jack the Ripper, and his case became one of the most famous and mysterious unsolved cases in history. In those days, on the other side of the Atlantic, Mexico also had a cold-blooded serial killer, Francisco Guerrero Pérez, known as the Mexican Ripper. Since he is the first recorded serial killer in Mexico, the Mexican media often compares him to Jack the Ripper. However, in reality, Francisco's criminal activities predated Jack the Ripper. His modus operandi was even more brutal and complex, involving rape, torture, strangulation, throat-slitting, and in some cases, decapitation of the victims. Moreover, Francisco was labeled as a born criminal by psychologists of that time. But is that really the case? In 1840, in the Mexican region of Bajío, a poor family welcomed their 11th child, Francisco. From as far back as Francisco could remember, the shadow of life had tightly enveloped him. In those days, Mexico's economic situation was extremely dire, with meager incomes for ordinary families. Due to poverty, food in the household was extremely scarce, and he was constantly in a state of hunger and malnutrition. His father's departure further stripped this fragile family of its last support. And the pressures of life caused Francisco's mother to lose her patience and gentleness, made she often vented her anger on the children, especially on Francisco. Beatings, strangulation, and slaps, these acts of violence were something Francisco endured several times a day. Later, in 1862, 22-year-old Francisco, driven by the desire to change his fate, set off alone for Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. In there, he found work as a cobbler and settled in the Paralvillo neighborhood, where he met Maria, a gentle woman. Not long after, the two quickly fell in love, got married, and had 4 children together. In the late 19th century, Mexico was ruled by a man named Porfirio Diaz. He was the longest-serving president in Mexican history and a well-known dictator in Latin America. During his rule, between 1880 and 1888, a disturbing series of murders happened. Along the banks of the Consulado River, which flows through the valley of Mexico City, numerous female corpses were found. Most of the victims had been decapitated, brutally beaten, and even dismembered, with their identities often unrecognizable. Among the known victims were Candelaria Garcia, Francisco Rivero, Maria Martinez, Margarita Rosas, Maria Lopez, Soledad Gonzalez, Maria Villagran, Josefa Rodriguez, Maria Munoz, Mirza Gallardo, and the killer of these heinous crimes was referred to in Spanish as the Consulado River Ripper. February 13, 1888, Francisco was arrested after being reported by several neighbors. The neighbors accused him of killing a poor woman engaged in prostitution, Gallardo. In early 1888, Gallardo was raped and had her throat slit, and her body was found along the banks of the Consulado River. According to witnesses, the last time she was seen alive was with Francisco. Before his arrest, Francisco had even boasted about his crimes in a tavern. He unashamedly claimed to have killed many prostitutes and believed he was contributing to society. In the past, Francisco always proudly declared himself a devout Catholic, having served as an altar boy in his childhood and attended to the Virgin of Guadalupe. However, his actions bore no resemblance to those of a religious person. He always dressed himself meticulously, wearing luxurious and elegant attire, soft cashmere trousers, exquisite charro vests, and well-tailored jackets, with colorful sashes around his waist. And his private life was extremely chaotic, with numerous mistresses and many illegitimate children. After Francisco's arrest, a woman named Amelia bravely stepped forward to publicly accuse Francisco of raping and attempting to murder her. Amelia was a hard-working laundress, and though her life was difficult, she always strived to maintain her dignity and hope. One morning in 1888, Amelia returned from a pilgrimage to La Santísima village near the town of Guadalupe. With a devout heart, she hoped that the Virgin's protection would bring her some solace. However, as she walked through the riverbank bush, Francisco suddenly appeared, dragged her to ground, and brutally assaulted her like a beast, trying to take her life. Fortunately, Francisco, thinking she was dead, left her by the riverbank and fled in haste. Initially, Porfirio's authoritarian regime attempted to censor and suppress news reports about the Consulado River Ripper. In those days, media freedom was severely restricted. The government was extremely sensitive to any news that might cause social unrest. But the Consulado River's crimes were just too brutal, and the news spread like wildfire throughout Mexico City. By the time Francisco was apprehended, the media frenzy was unstoppable, and his name quickly became the focus of everyone's discussion in Mexico City. In the end, Francisco was convicted of murdering Gallardo and assaulting Emilia. As for the rest of his crimes, they could not be prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. According to the laws at the time, Francisco should have been sentenced to death, but Porfirio personally overturned this verdict, sentencing Francisco to only 20 years in prison. In 1904, Francisco was pardoned and released early on the grounds of alleged wrongful conviction. After his release, he did not repent but became even more brazen. On June 13, 1908, he was arrested again. At this time, Francisco was accused of murdering an elderly woman. It was claimed that his motive for killing her was simply that the old woman had engaged in certain actions that indirectly angered him. Moreover, although the victim was called Antonia, her identity was not fully confirmed. As for why Francisco was arrested, it was due to his carelessness. At the time of the crime, a boy named Jose was herding by the river. After hearing the old woman's screams, he quietly approached and hid in the bush, witnessing the entire process of her being raped and murdered. There were also 2 girls at the scene who saw Francisco standing a few meters away from the crime scene, washing the blood from his arms, face, and chest with river water. Later, a journalist who had previously reported on the crimes of the Consulado River Ripper noticed the similarities between Antonia's murder and the murders committed by Francisco. So he immediately confirmed the situation with the 3 witnesses and reported Francisco's crimes to the police together with them. This time, Francisco's arrest did not cause much of a sensation, but his trial attracted the attention of over 2,000 spectators. He was found guilty of murdering Antonia and was sentenced to death once again. Meanwhile, a woman named Lorenza Arrusi also published a vivid account of an assault by Francisco. According to her statement, she first encountered Francisco near the railway in the Peralvillo neighborhood. It was an ordinary evening, and she was hurrying along when Francisco approached her under the pretext of borrowing a light for his cigarette. However, as she handed him the match, Francisco suddenly pulled out a knife and threatened her to accompany him to a nearby spot for a conversation. At that moment, despite being extremely terrified, Lorenza did not lose her composure. She cleverly lied that she needed to get some money, deceiving Francisco and narrowly escaping. However, 2 months later, she encountered Francisco again. At that time, she was not so fortunate. Francisco took her to a cave far from the residential area. There, he raped and tortured her for nearly 2 days, trampling her dignity and humanity into the ground. Fortunately, when Francisco left for a moment to buy pulque, a fermented wine, she seized the opportunity and fled the cave with all her might. In the days leading up to his execution, Francisco was transferred to the Lecumberri prison. The prison's towering walls and iron bars became the final resting place for his crimes. Inside his cell, he seemed to find a peculiar solace. Most of his time was spent reading a novel by a French author, Paul and Virginia. This work, which depicts innocent love and a beautiful life, formed a stark contrast to his dark past. Perhaps, in that fictional world constructed by words, Francisco found a fleeting and illusory sense of peace. In November 1910, as the flames of the Mexican Revolution were just beginning to ignite, Francisco's life also came to an end. There were conflicting reports about the cause of his death. Some claimed he died of tuberculosis, while others believed that typhoid fever triggered his physical collapse. There were even speculations that he suffered severe contusions after an accident, which ultimately led to his demise. Despite the various theories, the only confirmed pathological sign was cerebral embolism. At the time, Francisco was found unconscious in his cell and was urgently taken to Juarez Hospital, but he never woke up again. In the late 19th century, the field of criminology was dominated by the theories of Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist. Lombrosso's theory posited that born criminals were the product of specific lower-class groups in society. According to him, the ancestors of these criminals gradually degenerated in certain environments and deviated from humanity, becoming almost animal-like. He believed that born criminals typically came from impoverished backgrounds, were illiterate, had poor personal hygiene, crude manners, low intelligence, dark complexions, robust physiques, and rugged, almost simian-like facial features. Against this theoretical backdrop, criminologist Carlos Rumaniak asserted that Francisco was a born criminal. In his 1906 report, he pointed out that the existing evidence was insufficient to infer that Francisco committed his crimes under the irresistible drive of sexual perversion or out of morbid obsession, but rather due to violent factors. He believed that Francisco's criminal acts were the result of violent and conscious impulses, and that he was essentially a morally corrupt individual who had succumbed to violent depravity. However, modern criminological theories have provided a deeper understanding of Francisco's criminal psychology. Modern research indicates that he was not a born criminal, but rather the result of a combination of factors, including physiological, psychological, social, and environmental influences. His criminal psychology was likely rooted in the trauma he experienced during his childhood. His early years were marked by his mother's rejection and violence, and he never had a positive father figure, or the father figure he had represented violence against women. These painful experiences planted the seeds of hatred in his heart, which eventually evolved into an intractable Oedipus complex. He projected the image of his mother onto his victims, as if by assaulting them, he was also taking revenge on the mother who had abused him in his childhood. Moreover, Francisco was not a crude or intellectually deficient person. On the contrary, he was well-mannered and even polite. And his modus operandi was also highly organized, demonstrating that he was not a simple violent offender. Francisco never expressed any remorse for his actions. He was a person lacking the most basic empathy, with no guilt or compassion in his heart. Even until he took his last breath, he never expressed any remorse for his crimes. His life, like the crimes he committed, was filled with darkness and enigma. His death, like his life, was fraught with controversy and unsolved mysteries.